to do is start transitioning over to our economic outlook. So this year, we're transitioning a little bit, changing it up. Chris Akers, who was our economist on staff, left our office a little bit earlier this year. So we haven't really had an economist, so I thought we would borrow some. And I see that Rich is there. I think Patty, I've seen her name, and Nathan. If you'll all come off hiding your videos and put your faces out there. And we'll see, I think Rich will come on. I'll start a little bit. So obviously, perfect. So we've got our three folks here. We've got Rich Wobekin with CU. We've got Nathan Perry with Mesa. I just want to call it Mesa State, but I know it's changed its name. No, it's Colorado Mesa University. And then Patty Silverstein, a consultant running Development Research Partners. So as I mentioned, we were down an economist. So I needed three to help us out on this next segment. So as you heard from Nancy, and if you've listened to our presentations in the past, we know that there's this clear connection between the economy and population. And many folks watch economic growth, and especially job growth, to understand what's going to be in demand for housing and other community services. So we've got three folks here that are going to help us think about that for the next hour. So Rich is going to start us off, and he's going to give us a big picture, kind of look at US and Colorado. Then we'll have Nathan chime in and give us kind of more of a Western slope perspective. And then we'll tie things up with Patty, looking definitely at the Denver metro area. And we'll save some time for some Q&A. So with that, Rich, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to share your slide deck or share your slide screen.
So that far is good. Now, all right, so you can see that?
Yes, see it and hear you. Thanks.
Great, perfect. So again, as described by Elizabeth, thank you so much. It takes three of us to replace Chris Akers, and we kind of knew that all along. So we miss Chris, but we wish him all the best. I'm going to give you the overview, and we've all agreed to stay within a reasonable amount of time to leave plenty of time for Q&A, as Elizabeth also mentioned. So with that, let me start by talking about the overall picture of the U.S. macroeconomy. And these slides have been updated as of this morning's data, the new employment release. So I'll talk a little bit about that. As you're well aware, the U.S. economy had sort of a V-shaped recovery with GDP that came back rather quickly. And again, very strong stimulus and monetary and fiscal stimulus helped that recovery be very rapid, something I'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. You will see in our graphic that we have provided here that we are showing a slow decline in 2023. So in this particular graphic, we're building in a recessionary scenario, very mild, but somewhere around Q2 or Q3. There's lots of uncertainty about this, as you know, from monetary policy perspective and others. So nothing is baked into the cake, but that is what we're sort of using for all of our forecasts as we go forward right now. When you look at the employment recovery, I was calling this a swoosh recovery, but I've been accused of product endorsement for that. So I'm moving on and calling it check-shaped recovery. But as of this morning, you can see that we are up about 800,000 jobs from our previous peak, 153.3 million through October. And that's a nice recovery. When you look at that, getting back those jobs in a relatively short period of time. But I would highlight that if we had stayed on the original trend we were on before, we would still have about 2 million more jobs than we have right now. So we have, we have gotten back past previous peak, but the previous peak is not where we would be had we stayed on trend. And without getting into a lot of detail, giving the time constraints, let me say just very quickly The recovery has not been geographically or industry-wise equal. Even though the US has gotten back to previous levels of employment, not every part of the country has, nor not every industry group has gotten back to previous levels of employment. But when we look at this recovery, it is pretty amazing. Much quicker recovery than the 2001 or the 2008 recession. And again, the stimulus, you have to argue, at least in terms of employment, the stimulus was effective at getting the economy back on track. The side effects that we're experiencing now are sort of the counterpart of that, the inflationary impacts that we've had. When we look at the overall employment recovery from the pre-recession peak, just to look at some of the states around the country, the ones in the darkest brown and then brown and tan are the states that have gotten back into positive territory. And as of the last month's data that was released, this number grew somewhat substantially in terms of the number of states that passed pre-recession peak. But you can still see the upper Midwest and Northeast and other parts of the country are below where they were in February of 2020. So we're still seeing that sort of weakness in certain parts of the country. Now, one of the things everybody starts to talk about, of course, is the labor shortage. And here's Rich saying, "Oh, we should have 2 million more jobs if we had stayed on trend." And people there like, we can't find people now. Where are these people, and what's it going to take to get them back into the workforce and so on. And of course, one area where we're seeing a fair amount of tightness is the job openings and labor turnover survey. The number that came out just a little bit earlier this week, 1.9 jobs available for each unemployed person. So it's a very high number. It's a number that the Fed is paying, at least reportedly, paying a lot of attention to, showing that the labor markets are still extremely tight. But one area we do know where some of these quote jobs are missing is in multiple job holders. And again, this is a national number, but as of today, there are about 675,000 workers working a single job, if you will, who were multiple job holders before. So when we look at that, 675,000 jobs are there and represented people not working 2 jobs. And there could be all sorts of reasons for that. The one job they have may be better. They might have adapted to a different lifestyle that they had to because of COVID. And we can have a lot of different explanations, but this is the factual reality. One concern, however, is looking at productivity and unit labor costs. Right now, we have an extreme sort of divergence going on. Never really a good thing in terms of looking at the unit labor costs rising and productivity falling so dramatically. And certainly one of the things that continues to figure into the inflationary situation and the overall health of the economy. Moving along to some other quick sort of personal income numbers and looking at sort of the position of the household. When we're looking at the health of the economy, certainly the number one driver is consumption in the economy, 70% of GDP. I'm sure many of you have heard that many times before. So we start by looking at employment, and then how does that relate to income and ability to consume for households going forward. I will highlight, since I don't have all of the slides in here, I don't suggest that consumption is the most important part of the economy overall. I think investment is a very critical part. Government is a critical part with infrastructure investments and so on. But just in terms of percentage of GDP, we tend to very much focus on consumption. And again, that's driven by personal income. And you can see, thanks to the stimulus payments, we had dramatic jump up 3 different times in overall personal income that has sustained very strong consumption levels. If you were to carry that blue line across, you would see that we're even at higher consumption levels than trend would have been had we not had the COVID recession. And you can also see down below that a lot of those stimulus payments wound up increasing the savings rate in the economy fairly dramatically. That's the bumps in the red line down below. Particularly the third one in March of 2021, we saw a big jump up with the third one. The first one, of course, huge jump up, but that was related to people kind of panicking in the COVID, and so they saved a lot of the first check. But you can see it continuing to occur with the second stimulus check and with the third stimulus check. Also highlight, if you look down at the end, that the savings rate right now is very low, back to 2008 levels. And that is part of households dealing with inflation, trying to keep up their consumption patterns. And how many different ways can they do that? Well, one way they can do that is spend more of them dollars on consumption and less of it going into savings. Another way they can sustain that, of course, is by increasing their debt load. And right now, we just recently in the past month passed the debt levels that we had going into the COVID recession. So we're back to adding on to total debt in the economy. And you can see those sort of month over month changes here in terms of household debt or quarter over quarter changes provided by the flow of funds accounts, the so-called flow of funds accounts. So you can see those jumping up fairly significantly. When the third quarter comes out, it will also be a significant jump up. So households have the ability through income or debt. They have the willingness based on their sentiment or confidence, and this is what we want to look at here very quickly. We know that confidence levels and sentiment levels have been hit pretty hard by the inflationary impact. In particular, if you look at the graphic on the right-hand side, which puts a little bit heavier weight on the inflation number, you can see that we went back to 1980 levels of consumer sentiment when with the higher inflation. So you can sort of see 1980s was, of course, an inflationary time as well. You can see what kind of a toll that's taking on households. When we look at the overall inflation picture, it has gotten a little bit better, but it isn't responding as quickly as I think any of us hoped or the Federal Reserve hoped. The most recent numbers have Denver, Aurora, and Lakewood at a slightly slower rate of inflation, but still 7.7% in terms of the all items index. And when we look at that sort of overall picture, not doing particularly well. When we look at the overall picture in terms of the nation and Denver, what we saw in the most recent data was that core inflation was on the rise, and this is something that is particularly concerning to the Federal Reserve. This is not the food and energy piece, but it's everything else, and the Federal Reserve has been very concerned about that inflation number. And as we've seen, looking at the sort of bigger picture here, when we're looking at the federal funds rate, we see that the outlook has continued to be strong for higher and higher rate increases. Of course, they just met and raised 75 basis points additionally up to the 4% number a couple of days ago. But what really concerned the financial markets was they seemed to be signaling a slowdown in the short run, but potentially a higher number at the end of the increases, and that was somewhat reflected in their September voting pattern, where they were looking at numbers in the 4.5%, 4.75% range in 2023. So I don't need to really show you this slide. You're reading it in the paper and hearing it all the time. Just a quick comment on this. This level of mortgage rates really seems to be slowing the real estate market down nationally and also in Colorado. Lots of documentation of that. Perhaps hear more of that from our other panelists here in just a moment. So looking at Colorado quickly, again, we're looking at the big picture view here. The state has been doing extremely well. Not a top 10 state or a top 5 state that we were before COVID, but in many cases, a top 15 state, 16 states, somewhere in that range. So we're still a very, very strong state in the overall rankings. In GDP, you can see we're 7th in the country, so very, very strong. Unemployment rate, a little bit less favorable, but that might be somewhat deceptive. We've talked about that many times. Very strong in per capita income and per capita personal income and per capita personal income growth. So we are a high income state, but we are also, as you know, a high cost state. So maybe some of that's an offset. And the key one on this particular page that I really love is the labor force participation rate. Second one from the bottom, second line from the bottom, you can see we have the second highest labor force participation rate in the country. So looking at where we are now, just very quickly, the darker brown, again, are the strongest growth states. So this is 1 year growth through September. And we don't have the October numbers yet at the state level. And you can see that Colorado is amongst the strongest states in the country in terms of year-over-year job growth, the greater than 4% category. So very, very healthy economy. And when we look at that sort of where are we compared to where we were, we're up 2.7%, 63,000 jobs from our previous peak. So very strong job growth and continuing to have this very strong job growth in the overall state economy. And we're very pleased about that. When we look at the percent change in employment for the year, on the left-hand side, you can see to date, year over year, the vast majority of sectors have grown significantly percentage-wise, with the exception of trade, transportation, and utilities, and then financial activities. And of course, financial activities is being hit pretty hard more recently by the higher interest rate environment. But when you look at the right-hand graphic, it's where are these industry sectors compared to where they were in January of 2020. So we're comparing pre-COVID and where we are right now. And you can see natural resources and mining still down over 20% from where it was at its peak. Financial activities down slightly. And just in the last month's data, we see both leisure and hospitality slightly positive and government getting back to zero. That's in the most recent data that we have. Both of those were in negative territory and have just neutralized and gone slightly positive. So we do have the vast majority of our sectors back to essentially neutral or better, with the exception of the natural resources and mining sector. So we look at overall employment. This is the 1 year change in employment by MSA, and you can see sort of the diversity around the state. You'll hear more about that from my colleagues, but just sort of showing you. And this is every MSA in the country, every metropolitan statistical area in the country. So this is giving you a sense of, you know, the red ones are Colorado, but you can sort of see where Colorado shapes up compared to the entire country in terms of year-over-year job growth. When we look at private sector wages, this is through September. You can see that through September, year over year, we're up 6.1% in Colorado. That's a pretty big number. I mean, that's you know, a good number, but overall, we also know the inflation rate, as I just mentioned to you a moment ago, is 7.7%. So in terms of real wages, we're still looking at real wages that are not in positive territory. When we look at the FHA home price index across the state, you can see while we are not in the upper echelon, not in the top, say, 25% of home price appreciation MSAs in the country, all of our MSAs are in the top 50%, and this is through the second quarter. And you can see the, quote, lowest MSA in terms of appreciation, which is Grand Junction, is over 20% year over year. So this again highlights the sort of housing price pressure issues we've seen, perhaps one of the vulnerabilities that we see with the Colorado economy. And then moving along, Colorado residential permits, month over month, you would see more dramatic numbers, but when we look year over year through September, we're now down. And overall value of construction, when we look at the picture, also is pretty much flat year over year through September, but the non-building sector, the infrastructure is up 25%, non-residential is up 2%, and residential construction is down 8%. So this gives us a little bit of picture of what's going on in sort of the construction sector. So with that, I'm concluding my comments and passing the baton to my colleagues.
Great. Thank you, Rich, so much for your update on kind of what's going on nationally and within the state. Now I'd like to turn it over to Nathan Perry to kind of give us a peek of what's going on the Western Slope.
Hi, thanks for having me. I hope you guys can hear me and see my screen. I assume I'll get some angry chat messages if you can't. So,
All looks good.
okay, great. Let me. Okay, so I have a short presentation and just try and overview the Western Slope. There are a lot of counties on the Western Slope. So I decided to focus on the 7 that I really cover with my economic newsletters and some of my research. I want to just quickly hit on growth and employment, industry recovery, real estate, and energy. And I like to see these counties as kind of 2 different groups. Mesa, Montrose, and Delta really move together very well. And then Garfield, Rio Blanco, and Moffett, I see as another group. Routt kind of has its own identity, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But let me give you some context for what's going on in the Western Slope. So if you look at GDP in 2020, there's a specific trend with what's going on. So hopefully you guys can see my mouse. I'm going to use it as my laser pointer. I'm a laser pointer guy when I present. But you can see down here, Garfield, Routt, I put Pueblo in for a comparison, Rio Blanco. The energy counties got hit much harder in 2020 than the non-energy counties. So you think about Montrose and Delta, there's really no energy production in those areas. There's also not a ton of tourism. Montrose has some proxy tourism because they're so close to Telluride with their airport. But Delta and Montrose came out of COVID in 2020 fairly unscathed. In fact, Delta had a good year. But then you look at Garfield and you think about Rifle and you think about Glenwood Springs. What are the 2 things that got hit hardest in 2020? Well, it was tourism and then it was energy, right? So oil prices actually went negative there in the spring of 2020. So Routt, you've got Hayden and Steamboat, Rio Blanco, which 70% of its GDP is energy. So you see the trend of some of these Western Slope counties that are reliant on energy and tourism kind of got clobbered in 2020. And it's too bad because we've had some legitimate growth momentum over the past few years. And I'd like to illustrate that with the Mesa County GDP graph. So, going into the energy bubble of 2006, 7, and 8, the rest of the nation had a real estate bubble that we had to deal with. But the Western Slope had what I call a double bubble. We had this energy and real estate bubble. And, it led to what I call a kind of Great Depression style economics out here on the Western Slope. Just bad GDP numbers, stagnant employment. And it wasn't really until late 2016, early 2017, it's kind of different per county, that growth really started to pick up on the Western Slope. And we saw some really strong growth for the last, 2017, 2018, 2019. And I think we're going to have really strong growth numbers for 2021. At the county level, there's this crazy lag. It's almost a year from when you get the GDP numbers. So I'm really excited to see what the 2021 numbers are. But this is a trend that you see across almost all the counties on the Western Slope. The energy counties, Garfield, Rio Blanco, and Moffett, they didn't quite have the uptick in 2017, 2018, 2019 that Mesa, Montrose, and Delta had. The trend for those 3 counties is very distinctive. The energy counties kind of bounced all over depending on what was going on in the energy markets when you look at their GDP numbers. I only have a few slides, so I can't go through all of them, but that's the general trend. So I'm going to proxy Mesa for the story. Mesa County, of course, lost a lot of jobs April 2020, but recovered pretty well, and we're at peak employment numbers for the last decade. And you can see that in Montrose. Montrose is growing about this, the graph looks similar with Montrose. Delta stagnating a little bit. You see the energy counties stagnating a little bit in terms of employment, but all of them have either fully recovered or they're pushing towards recovery in terms of the employment numbers. The jobs data is a little bit different. We say Mesa, Montrose, and Delta job gains over the last decade, but for some of the energy counties, you actually see job losses. Rio Blanco, Moffett, you see gains in Routt. You do see some slight gains in Garfield. So the story's a little bit different depending on which region in the Western Slope you look at. One thing that's important to me, and a point I want to make, is that those 3 or 4 strong growth years that we saw led to legitimate standard of living increases. And we saw this for a lot of counties on the Western Slope. At the county level, there's a huge confidence interval around these household income estimates. But, we're starting to see a trend in a lot of counties of it going up. and it's following that upward trend in GDP. So, as an economist, you want to see growth lead to something in terms of standard of living. And, there are a lot of different proxies for that, but we're seeing all of them trend forward, which I think is really positive. And of course, it's county specific, but that's the general trend. In terms of job recovery from COVID by industry, it's been pretty strong. We have not seen energy recover. So you can see the blue line is mining, oil, and gas, and this is for Mesa County. Almost every other industry is recovered. There's some kind of strange county nuances. We see healthcare declines in a few of the counties. Delta County has lost almost 500 healthcare jobs. And I've been speaking to people in Delta. I was presenting there a couple of weeks ago. They just can't find people applying. That they have a labor shortage in healthcare right now, and I'm sure this is the case in a lot of different places. And I didn't put healthcare on this particular graph, but so the general trend is industry recovery through COVID. Energy is the one that hasn't recovered in all the counties. And then you see some of these nuances like healthcare in Delta County that stick out as, not recovered from and I guess I should be clear. I indexed all this to Q4 2019. And these are the percentage job changes, just so you know. Trying to get through a lot of slides quickly, so I'm not probably explaining exactly what you're looking at too well. But anyways, so before I talk about housing, generally speaking, the Western Slope, Mesa, Montrose Delta, I think the news has been very positive. The news is mixed in the energy counties. Route is still recovering. Steamboat got clobbered with COVID and tourism. Waiting to see what the current data says for them. But that's the general story for GDP and employment. Now, when we think of house prices, we think of the Front Range, and certainly in terms of total house prices or the how high the house price is, that's very true. The Front Range is got some very high prices. But Mesa, the Western Slope has not missed out on this horrific price increase trend. And on a relative basis, it's actually been a bit worse if you manipulate the data a little bit. And how I've manipulated this data is to look at when the Western Slope, or at least Mesa County, really started growing. And that was the beginning of 2017. And since economic activity has really picked up, we've seen 90% price increase, at least according to the Freddie Mac House Price Index. There are other ways you can measure this, of course. Compared to Colorado's 78% increase and the United States 70% increase. And so on a relative basis, we've seen this in a lot of counties, even though it's cheaper than Denver, we don't have the same wages. We don't have the same industries, that are high paying. So on a relative basis, I think this housing price run up has been rough and is causing a lot of problems, like it is in all of Colorado. Montrose, whenever I present out there, they're just, everything's about keeping up with the growth and how do we get more housing units and all these people migrating in, and you saw it in the presentation an hour ago. So these are all issues on the Western Slope. Housing affordability is a problem. If you live here, if you're moving from Denver, it's not, but if you live here, it's a problem. So we unfortunately are dealing with that as well. So I think the Western Slope, we have the Piceance Basin with oil and gas. We have coal in Northwest Colorado. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about that. Mesa County, which is the biggest county in the Western Slope, I think 12 years ago just got clobbered by the double bubble that I spoke about earlier. But really, Mesa County in the last decade, all non-energy jobs have increased, whereas energy jobs have actually kind of fallen. And so as what's happened is Mesa County has become a lot more diversified because of those two things happening. If it were just energy jobs falling, I'd be concerned, but they've got non-energy jobs rising. Now, Montrose and Delta don't care about energy, doesn't affect their economies. But then you see the percentage of GDP in terms of energy for Garfield, Rio Blanco, and Moffett, and you can see some of the struggles that Northwest Colorado, has in terms of economic diversification, and specifically with coal, the retirement of the coal power plants and the coal mines. You look at Rio Blanco and Moffett, which are coal heavy. You have some coal en route, but they have Steamboat Springs driving so much of their economic activity. that, you know, I have concerns about what's going to happen over the next decade in Rio Blanco and Moffett, and I have concerns about Garfield as well. You know, Garfield and Routt are very similar counties. Garfield, you have Rifle, which is oil and gas, and Glenwood, which is, you know, just this tourism and, you know, resorts, and then Routt is the same thing. You have Hayden, which is coal, and then and I hate to just typecast that, but they've got a lot of economic activity in Hayden that relies on coal, and then you've got Steamboat. So the very similar counties. I'm a little bit less worried about Routt as a county. I'm concerned about Hayden. But Garfield, Rio Blanco, and Moffett are the three counties that are on my radar. I think Mesa, Montrose, and Delta have a ton of growth momentum. It's Garfield, Rio Blanco, and Moffett that I'm concerned about. And just to show you kind of what's going on in the energy market, because it does matter. It matters less for Mesa the more time goes on, but it still matters for these other counties. You know, we've seen a big run up in natural gas prices. That's mainly what we produce in the Piceance. You know, other times when prices were actually lower, we had more rigs. If you look at 2018, we had 7 to 8 rigs. You know, the gray line is natural gas prices. The axis is over here. And we had 7 to 8 rigs. And right now you can see where prices are at. And we have 3 rigs in November. And in August, we had 4 rigs. And so everybody keeps asking, and I keep, you know, the Economist keeps asking the industry, hey, what's going on? You know, why aren't we scaling up on rigs? And, you know, I hear the same few things. The first is permitting is delayed and difficult. And so they're hoping when they get through that process, they'll be able to deploy a lot more rigs. But the second big constraint that exists in all industries right now is labor constraints. I'm not even sure they could deploy 7 to 8 rigs right now in this labor market. And I'm not sure they think that either. So, you know, that's an issue right now, because energy has the capacity to be the saving grace moving into a recession for counties in the Piceance. If we're going to move into a national recession and economic activity is going to fall, but we're going to be in a high energy cost environment, that could negate the effect of the national recession trend in parts of the Western Slope. So that's why I'm watching this, and we will see what happens. Energy is always fickle that way. So Mesa and Garfield, oil and gas jobs and wages. You can see the trend since the peak of 2008. The blue and gray line are Mesa, and the yellow and green line are Garfield. And you can see, you know, just the sheer volume of jobs and wages that came from this industry, but it has been in a downtrend since 2008. You know, you can see the cyclicality of this downtrend. Mesa seems to have more cyclicality. Of course, this is QCEW data. It's not perfect for time series, but it gives us a good picture. And then for Moffett, Rio Blanco, and Hayden, you can see the decline in regional coal production and jobs. So coal production has held steady since about 2017, but you can see that the coal jobs are slowly declining, and that's a trend we expect to happen. You know, I said I am worried about those areas. I think we tend to look at the number of miners and the number of people employed at the power plant, but there are a lot of supply chains that exist around these industries that support those industries. There are a lot of induced spending effects that come from these industries. And so, you know, there's ad valorem taxes, there's severance taxes. And I know these counties are small compared to the big picture of Colorado, but it's big in these areas. And so, you know, there's a lot of smart people. You got the Just Transition team coming up with solutions. You've got AG&C and different organizations in Northwest Colorado trying to come up with solutions. So I think there's a lot of innovative ideas. But without something, I think we're going to see some real economic decline in those regions. You know, I have hope that the economic activity will be replaced, but, you know, it's going to take some work. And here's employment by mine, just so you can see, you know, Foydle Creeks and Hayden, or close to that region. You can see, so Routt's lost a lot of those mining jobs. Trapper Mine decline. Then Calawayo and Deserado on Moffett, Rio Blanco are holding steady. So anyways, I hope that was a broad overview of many counties. I hope that worked.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Nathan. And actually, it's so exciting to have you as part of this presentation and what's going on. We really, I don't think I've ever had such an in-depth presentation on what's going on the West Slope. So really appreciate your sharing what's going on, and very interesting to see. So Thank you very much, Nathan. And last but certainly not least, Patty, give us a tie-up on what's going on kind of in this Denver metro area.
I would be happy to. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about what's happening in the Metro Denver region. So as I go through this, Metro Denver, primarily the data is going to be for the Denver MSA plus Boulder MSA. We look at those combined. So that's an 11 county area. But then we're also going to bring in a couple of other Front Range counties as I get into some other data as well. But generally, this Metro Denver region represents about 62% of our employment base here in the state of Colorado. So what happens here obviously has some very strong influences on the state of Colorado as a whole. So the three largest super sectors in Metro Denver represent nearly 50% of the total employment. That's professional and business services, wholesale and retail trade, and our government sector. Again, all levels of government, our state, our local, and our federal government employment. So what's really great to hear about this right now, professional and business services, again, which is our largest category. And we all know it's this crazy catch-all category, everything from legal and professional services on through to computer systems design, that this has been a growing sector. And I always like to say that that's really bodes very well for our whole economic structure, because as companies are starting to use those outsourced business services, they're starting to use more accounting services or legal services, it's tending to bode well that they're doing well at all the other sectors. So professional and business services has been a growing sector, one of our fastest growing sectors too in the Metro Denver region. But I want to slice and dice this a little bit differently. You know, we all know these are based on the North American Industry Classification Codes, but I'm going to now slice and dice this a little bit differently so we can talk about the industry clusters, because the industry clusters are really what is providing our economic base here in the Metro Denver region. And just as an example of how it gets sliced and diced differently, if I take a look at the aerospace industry, for example, I'm going to be taking a look at some of what is in professional and business services, because that's where a lot of the software companies are, and many of our software companies have a very strong aerospace mission. It could be some of our governmental entities. I mean, the National Atmospheric Research Center there has a very strong aerospace type of mission as well. So we need to pull in some of these various governmental entities. And also on the manufacturing side, that's where we see a lot of our aerospace companies, because they're busily making everything from rockets and satellites and all of those various space missions. So when we slice and dice this a little bit differently, and I add in Northern Colorado now to this whole analysis, where we're bringing in Larimer and Weld counties into this as well, because the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation serves this entire 7-county region there. So there are 9 industry clusters that we see as really serving as the foundation for this whole kind of Front Range area there. Again, aerospace, one of our key industries, on through to aviation. Notice food and beverage production, as well as energy and natural resources. We look at more from a whole state level. And so some of the data that I will share are more state level types of information. But notice that we break these into what we call subclusters then. So under food and beverage, it's food production, it's beverage production, it's agri-tech. In our bioscience, broadband digital communications, energy, natural resources, financial services, healthcare and wellness, and IT software. One of the best ways to really demonstrate what has been happening within these various industries is through our bubble chart. So there's a lot of data, a lot of information packed onto here, and I want to just go through it very quickly. But first of all, we have a location quotient, which is basically trying to say, is that concentration of that industry greater than or less than the national average? And we see that our aerospace industry here in the Metro Denver and Northern Colorado region has a concentration that is nearly 5 times the national average. Indeed, Colorado as a whole has the second largest aerospace economy in the country, the highest concentration of aerospace in the country. When we take a look at the colors of on the various bubbles here, again, remember those various subclusters? All of those various subclusters are going to be in the same color. So these green bubbles here represent part of our energy and natural resources industry. And notice that those were some, just as Nathan was talking about the challenges of oil and gas on the western slope, these industries here in the Front Range area too have been challenged. So when we take a look at our natural resources, which includes all of the oil and gas drilling within Weld County, we see that that we're seeing some losses in employment in 2021. What was also surprising and very challenging for us is that we were also seeing some losses in terms of renewable resources. Indeed, those renewable resource companies had some of the greatest employment losses of our industry clusters in 2021. The size of this bubble represents the size of the employment base. So this light blue bubble here is healthcare and wellness. That represents our largest industry base, about 243,000 people that are employed in this region. Versus you get to somebody like agritech, and even though this is a statewide number, only about 2,100 employees within that. So the very small bubble there. The largest, or the industry that experienced the fastest growth rate in 2021 was our biotech and pharmaceuticals super industry cluster there. That's that yellow bubble there. That was certainly helped along by all of the COVID recession, because it definitely became very obvious that we needed to develop new therapeutics, new identification processes of the whole COVID virus. And many of the companies that we have operating within the Metro Denver region were some of the first ones on the front lines to put forth some new ideas regarding how to track this. So biotech and pharmaceuticals really one of our fastest growing. Over time, if we were to take a look at this over the past 5 years, IT software there would have been the fastest growing over that whole 5-year process. I could talk for hours. There are great stories, great success stories, also great challenges within many of these industries. But again, we do this industry cluster analysis because this serves as our economic base. It is our hope that even as some of these industries may be challenged, such as energy and natural resources recently, others will be picking up the slack and continuing to grow. Also, this gives us a very diverse industry base to work with here within the Metro Denver region. It provides a diversity of occupations, a diversity of industries, and also a diversity of geographic concentrations. Even though these are those key industry clusters throughout the entire region, we know, for example, that a lot of our bio tends to be focused more in the Boulder County area. A lot of our broadband and digital communications more in the Denver Tech Center. So it gives us a wide variety of opportunities and opportunities for growth throughout the entire Denver metro region. Add all that together, what we're seeing happening here in the Metro Denver region. Right now, employment growth is increasing by about 4.6%. It's a pretty fast type of growth rate, and certainly is tracking right along with the whole statewide average. Our forecast had been that our employment growth would continue in 2022, but at a slightly slower pace. I'm not sure that that's really going to play out this year? I mean, at this point in time, we are growing at a faster pace. Nonetheless, our forecast as we had developed it was still suggesting that we would see a slightly slower pace. We'll see how all that plays out. I want to hit on commercial real estate very quickly, office, industrial, retail. This is for the Metro Denver marketplace. In the charts here, we show the green bars there reflect the direct vacancy rate. The gray bar at the top reflects the sublease space, and the red line reflects how much additional space has been added within each of those various years. The office market, we know, has been challenged with COVID. We've seen that whole shift to remote work. I mean, even though we are seeing a lot of folks coming back into the office, at a national level, we're still only at about 50% of our office workers are back there every day. So we're seeing that this is challenging to our office market, and we're especially seeing that in terms of the amount of sublease space, the highest amount of sublease space since 2002 right now in the Denver metro market. On the industrial side, the big story has been all of the new construction activity. Indeed, we have now seen 6 years of building 5 million square feet or more of new industrial space in the Metro Denver market. It has been a very hot market, but we're starting to see some slowdown in paces in that, as companies such as Amazon or other e-commerce companies have said, you know, we've about gotten to the point where we've built out our logistics network. So we're not going to see quite as much development in that in the years ahead. Retail, surprisingly stable, but we've also been building next to nothing, and we've been repurposing, reusing the retail space that we have. On our consumer side in the Metro Denver region, consumer activity up by about 11% through the first half of the year. We do expect that this is going to pull back a little bit. Keep in mind, these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. So again, as Rich had mentioned, you know, that 7.7% inflation rate in the region means that real increase in retail trade activity, that real increase in retail spending is a little bit lower, obviously, than that 11% that we have been tracking. But by and large, very confident consumers that are still out there and spending. The one thing consumers are not liking these days is how quickly housing prices have gone up and how challenging that has been. One of the things that we are seeing within the marketplace, though, of course, is as those mortgage rates have gone up, we're starting to see a real pullback in sales activity. We're starting to see a little bit of slowdown in terms of how quickly these home prices are going up. But we need to keep in mind that according to the National Association of Realtors, the Boulder MSA is the 6th most expensive metropolitan statistical area in the country. Denver MSA coming in at number 13, and this is based on their survey that includes a little over 180 metropolitan statistical areas. So we are still seeing these rapid increases in prices, although a little bit of pullback. Sales activity is down by 17% right now in the Metro Denver region, but home prices are still growing by around 13%. And I know there have been a lot of folks out there that have said, oh, this is a housing recession, and oh my goodness, all of these home prices, they're just plunging. You know, in what reality did we think that a 25% increase in home prices over the year was reasonable? No, even a 12 to 13% type of increase that we are seeing is still not reasonable. So I would suggest this is not necessarily a housing recession, but rather a much needed housing correction that is happening. And that's happening too on our apartment vacancy side, our apartment rental rates. Apartment rental rates are still going up by 12, 13% throughout Metro Denver. Certainly it varies throughout the whole metro region. You get prices that are lower in Adams County versus higher in Douglas County. But on average right now, we're at about $1,860 in terms of that average rental rate. The good news there is that, yes, we have been adding more units, as was mentioned already too, in terms of building permit activity. But as Nancy had discussed, we saw this huge run up in the number of building permits in 2021, pullback in 2022 now. But, you know, we're starting to feel like maybe, dare I say, getting into some type of equilibrium level of construction activity. So with that, I turn it back to you, Elizabeth. Thanks so much.
Super. So thank you very much, Patty, for that information. And we'll ask both Nathan and Rich to come back on video to start asking a couple of questions for you guys. So obviously, in our line of work in the State Demography Office, what we're really interested in looking at is this relationship between jobs, the economy, and the total and the population, and driving that total population. So when we're thinking about risks to the forecast or potentially headwinds, for your area in maybe 30 seconds or less, what do you think is the biggest headwind in terms of total employment for the next couple of years? And I'm going to start with you, Nathan.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, to kind of phrase it differently, is going to be housing and labor, which I think, you know, the Federal Reserve is trying to fix with rising interest rates and monetary policy. But I think that's the constraint right now, is people can't find a place to live. I mean, we are bringing in new faculty and they sit there for 6 months and are unable to, you know, we have one faculty member that lived out of a VRBO for 3 months because they couldn't find a place. I mean, that's how crazy, and these guys make okay salaries. So that's a constraint, you know, and I think the tight labor market is hurting healthcare and it's hurting energy. So we could use more migration from Denver. Thanks, everyone. Send people this way. Well, we got to build housing first.
Super. So same then question to you, Patty. What is that biggest constraint or challenge of the next couple of years in job growth?
So I think, I mean, Nathan certainly hit upon two of the biggies in terms of that housing and also the tight labor market. I mean, that's influencing us. What I would also suggest too is water. You know, we are really looking at how do we serve the population growth, the employment growth within the area. In the Metro Denver region, I would also add the perception of safety. You know, we are seeing more homelessness throughout our central core, and indeed that is spilling into more of the suburban locations and providing this whole perception of, you know, is this community a safe one? And I think that that's something that needs to be addressed too, because we need to make sure that we are still an attractive region, that we are still regarded as an attractive region for that new labor to come to.
Perfect. And then same question to you, Rich, and think big picture, state as a whole, what maybe those challenges or constraints are.
Well, they're consistent. I mean, I think the housing issue is a statewide issue. I don't think it's just a front range issue, but to go the bigger picture, for me, it's whether or not the national economy grows, how well the Fed handles this inflation, soft landing, and more skeptical about that now. And you know, Colorado doesn't correlate one-to-one with the national economy, but it's certainly affected by the national economy. And right now, I think some would argue we're on the precipice of a global recession, not just a U.S. short-term recession. So that darkens the outlook a little bit in terms of the headwinds.
Perfect. So kind of tagging on this question about how housing and labor force. This is where I get a little confused with federal policy. So it seems like job growth isn't good when that's going counter to what the feds want. But when we see positive job growth numbers, that means actually positions are being filled, which I would think is good because we've got this demand for workers. Likewise, we've got this challenge where home builders are now with federal policy starting to slow potential new permits. I was at a meeting yesterday and they're like, really, I'm not sure we need to build. I'm like, oh, but we still don't have enough housing yet. So how do we bring all of these pieces together to where we can balance? And actually, you could raise your hand if you think you've got a good answer. Nobody's gonna. Anybody? Oh, but you're the experts.
All right, I'll jump in. How do we balance? You know, I think that that's really one of the greatest challenges here because, yeah, generally we're a region that we love. We're excited when we get that new company announcement and the new the new business that is coming in, but then we realize, oh, it brings people, and we're not real happy about that. I think that in the economic development world, we're going to see more emphasis on the types of jobs being brought in. To make sure that we really have that match of skill set for the companies that are coming in, and really we're working very diligently at trying to make sure that our talent attraction matches with our business attraction. So that's maybe one solution.
Yeah, and I just based on this question, but lots of things we see coming on the horizon a decade or more out, I think the role of robotics is going to be huge in terms of providing output in the economy. And that will translate into more people necessarily, but it should translate into hopefully better salaries for people, more productivity in the economy. And it's not going to come at the expense of someone not having a job because we don't have the people to work in these jobs at this particular moment. And it doesn't look like it's going to get a whole lot better going forward.
Nathan, for your end, on the Western Slope, is construction or housing especially, is that continuing or is it facing some questions as well like we're seeing on the Front Range?
I think multifamily is continuing, but single family home building is pausing. And so that's what I was thinking about with your question is the Fed's raising rates. And I'm interested to see how much of this housing demand was real or housing shortage was real versus artificial, because suddenly VRBOs are not as popular, rental properties are not as profitable, right? And people are not buying second homes with high interest rates. I'm interested to see how much of this levels out. But I think that multifamily, you can see it in the permit data, is still building. We'll have to see how interest rates affect that. But the single family homes, the builders I talk to, they're very worried right now. At these rates, I think building single family homes is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, it is that double-edged sword where it is interesting to see the higher interest rates potentially diminishing demand from investments and investment buyers into VRBOs or rentals. But then it also discourages your basement dweller that's trying to buy that first home, trying to get out and start. You know, they can't make it work either. So it is an interesting double edge, and it makes you wonder how we're going to kind of get over that hump. A couple of questions for you, specifically, Nathan. What is the impact in Montrose County of the West End and the loss of that energy economy or the closure of that mine and plant? What are you seeing for Montrose?
Yeah, so the nuclear area it's funny because all the data we get, and you guys know this as economists, is at the county level. I don't get GDP data for Montrose City and then Nucla. But, the west end of Montrose has been hit by this, and they're very small, so it doesn't show up in the general Montrose County data. The Montrose County data is really strong. But for the folks in Western Montrose, it's real, and I think that area is struggling right now. And I don't have more than anecdotal evidence. I don't have good data on West Montrose versus the rest of Montrose, but, they kind of get pulled together. So, point taken, I say how great Montrose is doing and how much growth momentum they have. But there are parts of Montrose that are struggling.
That is sticking with you a little bit still, Nathan, on the Western Slope. Do you see any of those energy jobs converting into like maybe more wind and solar jobs at all?
Yeah, well, that's the big question is the Western Slope going to be able to leverage this elimination of coal into, hey, let's manufacture solar? And it's just not as easy as, hey, we're losing our coal mine and let's build a solar manufacturing plant. Now, a lot of people think, well, we can just put solar plants or solar panels out here. And that's great. You collect tax revenue from that and the county can sell it and generate revenue, but that doesn't generate jobs. I think to replace the jobs is what we need is solar manufacturing. And, that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse as to whether a manufacturing firm wants to come up to Craig. But certainly I know that there, like I said earlier, Just Transition, AG&C, there's all these organizations thinking, how do we incentivize a variety of industries to come up here and utilize the infrastructure that exists, the energy infrastructure, maybe even do something different with the coal mining. So I think there are a lot of ideas being generated, but I don't think having solar panels by itself is going to replace that economic activity. We need to make the solar panels. So certainly there's interest, but I don't know if it's happening.
Perfect. So I know you guys primarily focus short run. You go a couple of years out. We have to forecast out to 2050, and I got a call yesterday from Colorado Water Conservation Board saying that they would like forecasts out to 2060 or maybe even to 2070. Long run, big picture. Even if you could go 10 years out in your kind of geography, and we'll let Patty go first on this one. How competitive do you see the Denver metro area 10 years out?
So we have a shining gem that sits on our eastern edge here, Denver International Airport. Right now, Denver International Airport is the third busiest in the world and has great plans for expanding their operations there. This is really critical for many of the different companies that are looking to grow and expand within this region, being able to get to their goods, their services out to the rest of the world. So that's really one of our great opportunities for growth and one of our great assets to make sure that we stay competitive. At the end of the day, though, what I'm also kind of pondering is what's going on in Utah and Idaho. They have been coming on very strong in terms of competitor positions in our economic development realms there. And I think it's because, too, they're very similar to Colorado, but yet they have fewer people, maybe lower costs, more space. And so that I see as really one of our greatest challenges to our competitiveness is our position relative to some of the rest of the region.
Perfect, thank you. So now, same question to you, Rich. Going 10 years out, Colorado as a whole, competitiveness.
Elizabeth, as difficult as forecasting population out that far, for at least one of the entities we're forecasting revenues for, we're forecasting out to 2050. So, and maybe not humorous to you, we're using population as a significant piece of that economic forecast. You're using economic jobs as part of the population forecast. So I guess it's a little circular, but I pull the numbers for the decade 30 to 40. Okay, so for that 10-year span, we're forecasting total growth in the US economy of jobs of 1.4% for the decade. And for Colorado, job growth of 7% for the decade, still maintaining a competitive advantage. I totally echo what Patty just said. I think Salt Lake City and Utah is a significant challenger to us. Boise, Idaho area, both of those very strong. But still see Colorado in a national context as very competitive. But those are numbers that we haven't seen in a long time. And a big piece of this is the fact that the whole country gets older. We're not having all the demographic stuff that was described in the beginning, and I'm sure will be described in Cindy's session coming up. And that's a big part of the deal. That's why I mentioned the robotics piece. We don't see the US GDP growth being, if we can't figure out some of this other machinery and robotics types of things, we could be talking about pretty low GDP growth as well, not just employment growth.
Perfect. Thank you. And Nathan, to tie things up, thoughts? Next 10 years.
Yeah, well, going back, I can't remember who mentioned it, but drought, I think it was Patty. When I think about the West in general, so we're talking about Colorado being a competitor to Utah and Idaho, I worry about all of the West in general over the next 10 years because of drought. And, we see climate change. We also have, I'm not a weather person, what is it? El Nino, some sort of weather pattern that's making things also worse on top of climate change. And so, Utah has some very difficult drought problems, worse than Colorado. I mean, the Great Salt Lake is drying up. And I wonder how the West in general is going to appeal to people when water costs are high, you can't water your lawn, and it looks fundamentally different than it has the last 10 years. So I don't mean to be a downer. I'm supposed to say, go West, but I think to me, that's what when I think about 10, 20 years down the road, and I think about any Western state, I think about drought and how's that going to affect development? How's that going to affect Las Vegas? How's that going to affect Phoenix, Western Slope? Maybe Denver doesn't have as big of a drought problem. Maybe that positions, the Front Range and the Eastern Plains in a better position because the drought issues are not as distinctive as Nevada and Utah. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts. Not a good answer, but I have a lot of thoughts about the topic.
No, actually, I think that's really helpful. And I think it's really important to be thinking about some of those bigger spatial issues for sure. And certainly drought and water is really important to think about. So